I want to introduce Gene Kim, founder of Tripwire, author of the Visible Ops Handbook, the best book on ITIL I've ever read, and the upcoming DevOps Cookbook.
Good morning. My name is Gene Kim. I'm so excited to tell you about my 13-year journey studying high-performing IT organizations. This actually started for me in 1999 when I started keeping a list of what we call geniuses of people with great kung fu. These are people who talk differently, acted differently, but more importantly, they had profoundly different results than your typical IT organization. So that's what went into a book called the Visible Ops Handbook, thank you, Nigel, that we wrote in 2004. And I'm currently working on two books right now. One is called When IT Fails, a business novel, and the second one is called the DevOps Cookbook. So in the next 23 minutes, I'm going to share with you why I care so much about this, as well as I'm going to share with you 6 prescriptive steps that I'm hoping you can actually take away that will be applicable to you, and then you can actually put into practice and start changing those outcomes. When Luke and Paul talk about when IT sucks, or if IT sucks, I'll say I agree, but I'd like to just take a moment to tell you about, I think, maybe talk about some of the symptomology, and maybe talk a little bit about why I care so much about this. It's a very cavalier statement to say, IT sucks, but I think it actually has a very human cost, and I actually genuinely believe it's probably one of the most monumental challenges that we're facing as a profession, and it's actually one of the most gigantic business problems that we can solve that will create more economic value than anything that we've seen in the past 30 years. So I'm going to share with you what I believe is the destructive downward spiral of which happens in IT that happens in 4 acts. The first act begins with IT operations. So if you're in IT operations and you're supporting a large, complex, revenue-generating application, one of the things that you might have been found yourself before is supporting a very fragile application. And so when we talk about fragile, why do we call it that? It's because they break all the time, right? They're constantly breaking, and it takes forever to figure out what went wrong. Right? And I guess the shameful part of this is that it's not an internal monitoring tool that tells us there was a failure. Sometimes it's a salesperson saying, hey, Gene, I just noticed that the revenue pipeline stopped for the last 6 hours. What happened? Or, hey, Gene, all the banner ads being served in the Vietnam market is being served upside down in Spanish. What happened? Right? And often we just don't have great answers. When this is actually a genuinely important business process or a genuinely important business initiative, when these things happen, something inevitable happens, which is that the business starts missing the commitments that they make to the outside world. It could be that market share isn't going up. It could be average order sizes aren't going up. It could be that page load times are going down. It might be the e-commerce site is down. Regardless, when companies make external commitments to analysts or Wall Street, right? When this happens, something even more insidious happens, which is entering Act 2, the product managers. Right? So what I've seen happen is that when the business starts missing the commitments they make, especially when it's made to Wall Street, they start making even larger, more audacious commitments to Wall Street, often dreamed up by art majors or creative writing majors who have maybe not the best grasp of what technology can and can't do. Right? And let me make this clear. Some of my best friends are art majors. Right? I like them fine, but often they create requirements that are actually unachievable both for development and operations. And so when there's a commitment made to the outside world, we enter Act 3, the developers. Right? Suddenly, they start seeing urgent, date-driven projects put into the queue where you cannot move the ship date, right? Because there's a commitment been made. So something very insidious starts happening, right? Suddenly, we have to start cutting corners, right? Suddenly, all the dev cycles are now being spent on features as opposed to the non-functional requirements, which means we have to take more and more technical shortcuts, which means we have even more fragile code being put into production. And worse yet, right, fragile applications become even more fragile. And so we start accruing technical debt. So to me, right, when I think about technical debt, I think about this, right? But I mean, this doesn't really get to the notion of debt. Debt gets worse. So this becomes this, right? So it's not just about fragility of applications, right? It doesn't matter whether it's hardware or configuration setting in your virtualization layer. It's actually something more insidious starts to happen, right? Is that deployments start getting more difficult, right? What used to take an hour starts taking 3 hours, starts taking a day, starts taking 2 days, right, for IT operations, which is okay because you can get it done over the weekend, which sucks, but at least you can get it done without interrupting the service window, right? But it takes 3 days. Okay, now we have a problem, right? Doesn't fit in a weekend anymore. Starts taking a week, starts taking 2 weeks. Has anyone had this happen before or can relate to elements of the story? Yes? Okay, right, this is terrible, right? And the worst part is the deployments become so difficult, so arduous. There becomes so many moving pieces that the business corrective action is we're going to reduce the number of deployments. We're going to lengthen the deployment interval. And so you may be thinking this is exactly the wrong thing to do, right? You know, your inner Allspa or inner Jez Humble might be saying we need to shrink batch sizes, not increase batch sizes. But to no avail, right? We're going to go from 6-month releases to 9-month releases to yearly releases. And now we have more moving parts than ever. The failures become larger than ever, right? And then, in my mind, it starts to look like this, right? I think in my mind, the developer says, hey, I committed the code to production. Should have worked. It worked worked on my workstation, right? And yet, this developer didn't realize that they just created 6 weeks of work for IT operations. And so, this is where now you have an ever-increasing amount of tension between development and operations. Right. So I think this eventually leads to this, right? Suddenly, when operations and development are stuck in tribal warfare, the feature flow rate starts to go to a trickle. No work is getting done. We're consumed in unplanned work, right? Our project work is now being starved, right? Suddenly, we all feel like we're trapped in a system that preordains us to failure. And not only is this causing a business problem, right? We're not delivering the things we need to market, but it's causing operational problems, development problems. And I think the real human cost is that suddenly we feel helpless and trapped in a system that preordains us to failure. So I think this is a very important problem. So when we say IT sucks, I think it's a very important problem. It has a very human cost. So by the way, all of this can be encapsulated in this slide, and I'm going to reference this later. So the reason why I think this is important is that this happens because of a core chronic conflict set up whenever you have development and operations working against diametric goals, right? So development is often motivated to ship as many features to market, which means ship whatever it takes, right? While operations cares about availability, uptime, and stability, right? And that means no changes ever, or no changes over my dead body, right? Which I've learned can be arranged. Right? And this leads to the chronic deadlock. I think just to sort of punctuate this happens everywhere. Right? Whenever this core conflict occurs, you're going to get these outcomes. But more importantly, regardless of what business they think they're in, right? Every company is an IT company, right? Because we can see that 95% of all capital projects have an IT component, and 50% of capital spending is on technology-related things. So the work that we do, whether the business realizes it or not, is some of the most important flows of work in the entire organization. So there must be a better way. I'm going to briefly share with you sort of the slides that changed my life. When John Allspa and Paul Hammond gave the seminal 10 deploys a day presentation at the Velocity Conference in 2009, the world was rocked when they were saying, holy cow, 10 deploys a day? In a world where most organizations were doing one release every 9 months or once every year, right? They said, it's not only possible, right, but it's because dev and ops are working together to solve a common objective. And we need ops people who think like developers and developer people who think like ops people. And what results is not only just a torrid summer of love, but getting outcomes that the world has never seen before. One of the things that we found in high performers was that the best always get better. The best always accelerate away from the herd. And I'll tell you right now, we see this happening in the service delivery space. Jeff Jenkins, also at the Velocity Conference, said they're not doing 10 deploys a day. They're doing a deploy every 11 seconds, right? 1,000 deploys in an hour, right? So this is somewhere between 20 and 30,000 deploys in a given day. So I think there's just an inherent competitive advantage in getting this right. So what I'm going to share with you are my 6 favorite patterns that I'm hoping you can put into practice right away and get some great outcomes. And we're going to frame this into 3 ways. Sort of the underpinning principles, and maybe they may sound like platitudes, but of which you can derive all of the DevOps patterns. The first way is all about left to right as you go from development into operations. And as Andrew Schaefer said, why dev and ops? Is because dev and ops is what's between the business and the customer, right? The business turns it into requirements, which are worked into dev. Then our value is actually created at operations. So the 4 platitudes of which underscore the first way are understanding the flow of work as we go from left to right, always seeking to increase flow, and so there's just a tremendous amount of tools created by Lean, theory of constraints, that tell us how to elevate bottlenecks, increase flow, decrease wait times. The philosophy of never unconsciously passing defects downstream, right, to the downstream work center. And never locally optimizing, that causes to cause global degradation. And then achieving what Deming would call profound appreciation of the system. So let's talk about 2 practices that we can derive from the first way. I love this one. Ben Rockwood at Joyent said, it's very frustrating being in annual business planning sessions because it's going to be maddening because they treat IT operations like an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? So one of the things that he reflected back at me after reviewing When IT Fails, the novel, is there's 4 ways to look at work inside of IT operations, right? Instead of one homogeneous pool, one big buffet thing, there's actually 4 types. One is business projects, right? Like the new order entry system, the new business process. Internal IT projects, often which will result from a business project, but this would be like getting that incredible Puppet automation tool running. 3 changes. So when Paul was talking about the ticketing system, like, all of those commitments, all of those tickets in the ticketing system represent a commitment, right? It might be 10 man years of work, but or 10 organization years of work, but you have to quantify it. And then 4th is unplanned work, right? All those break-fix issues. And so, we're in a bad place when when we as an organization are spending all our time on unplanned work. So the goal here is to kind of reframe, redefine what work is, and then make it visible, right? So that we can have a more fair discussion with the business when on the input side, and then we can be held more accountable of like what are the important things we want on the output side. And then obviously we want to reduce work in process in the middle. The second practice, okay, so that's redefine work. Practice number 2 comes from this issue where development says we need to ship next week, right? And everyone in ops is going, ship what? Holy cow, that's not even designed to run, let alone be deployed, right? So, this is where, as an ops person, right, this is where we say we've just been trapped or set up by development and marketing. So practice number 2 is creating a one-step environment creation process, right? And so the goal here is to make environments available as early as possible in the development process, right? So ideally, right, when we start a new dev project, environments are already there, right? Like a pick and pack list. Do you want a small, medium, or large environment? And if it's not there, right, you want to be able to be building it in parallel with a development organization. So with that one-step environment creation process, we want to build the code and the environment at the same time and be able to simultaneously build all the environments in parallel, right? Dev, QA, and production. And I think one of the greatest things that we sort of put into the DevOps Cookbook is kind of reframing the agile policy where instead of having shippable code at the end of each sprint, we've changed it so it reads, at the end of each sprint, we have shippable code and the environment it operates in, right? So never again can development take up all the time in the schedule and leaving no time for operations because we're now working in parallel, and then at the end of each sprint, we have some confidence that the thing will actually deploy and run. So by putting these 2 practices into practice, right, here's the outcomes that we would expect. We want to be able to create a single repository for code and the environments, right? And that's, as Jez Humble says, creates not only a single repository of truth, but it becomes a communication vehicle in itself. 2 is we're creating determinism in the release process, right? As Paul was saying, in order to be repeatable, you must first define it, right? And so it's now for the first time potentially repeatable. We have consistent environments at the earliest stages of the development project, and we're decreasing the cycle time for releases. So instead of releases taking a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, right, we actually can now shrink them. And by doing this, we have a faster release cadence. So how do you go from 1 release every year down to 10 deploys a day, right? It's through application of the first way. The second way, to summarize, the first way is all about the flow of work from left to right as you go from development to ops. But the second way is all about the reverse, right? How do you create those feedback loops from ops into dev? And so the platitudes or the principles would be, how do we understand and respond to the needs of all customers, right? And the customers are not just the end customer who uses the service, right? Deming would say the customer is actually defined as whoever the next operation is, whoever the next work center is, right? So we are a customer of development, and we should have a working relationship that reflects that. 2 is we want to shorten and amplify all feedback loops, right? So the best embodiment of this is the Toyota andon cord, right? When something goes wrong, right, it's expected that you pull the cord to stop the entire line, right? Because the greater sin is to actually allow that defect to perpetuate or be amplified downstream. And then ideally, we want to create quality at the source, right? So the best ideal is designing for manufacturing, where engineers are working, are optimizing the parts for production for the people who are actually assembling it in production. And you do that by creating and embedding knowledge and capabilities where you need it. So the 2 patterns here, I'll share next. Here, this is actually one of my favorite quotes. This came from Patrick Lightbody, who had a company called Browser Mob. So it was cloud-based testing. He said, we found that when we woke up developers at 2 a.m., defects got fixed faster than ever, right? I love that, right? So, so that's our next pattern, right? We want to embed dev into IT operations, right? So certainly want to embed dev into the escalation process. I think level 3 is probably appropriate. But also, we want to make sure that dev is invited to the postmortems, the root cause analysis meetings, right? So that they can see, what things they're doing, or they can actually see the effects of decisions they make. And then we actually want to have dev start cross-training operations as much as we can, right? So that we can get that as part of the tribal knowledge base, and make sure that we have the measurements all the way up and down the application stack. So that's actually patterns 3 and 4. So the outcomes of applying the second way really are, we find that we want defects, security issues, the non-functional requirements getting found and fixed faster than ever. We want reusable ops user stories are now part of the agile process. In other words, we can now have a deployment story that can be a part of every development project, so we know what resources it takes, what hardware resources it takes, how long it takes, and now that can facilitate planning and execution. And then all groups should be coordinating and communicating better. And then that means everyone's getting more work done. So let's go to the third way. The first way is all about left to right, from dev to operations. The second way is all about right to left, from ops into dev. The third way is all about creating a culture of continual experimentation and learning, and Luke alluded to this earlier. In my mind, I think the goal here is really to achieve two things. One is to foster a culture that fosters experimentation and taking risks and learning from failure and successes, right? But also that's predicated on understanding that repetition is a prerequisite to mastery, right? So whether it's sports training or special forces or IT operations, practice makes better, makes perfect, right? And so why these two things? We need a culture that keeps pushing us into the danger zone, right? And say it's safe to take risks. Second, but we also need the habits to be able to say, holy crap, we went too far, right? Now we need to retreat from the danger zone and get us back to a place of safety. So let's go to this, the next pattern. Right, this came from Adrian Crowcroft. We want to do painful things more frequently so you can make it less painful. And when we do this, we don't get pushback from development when we break things because they view it as critical to making rollouts go smoother and more quickly. So pattern 5 is inject failures more often. The famous AWS zone failure outage. Actually a friend of mine, Josh Corman, he was giving a talk at Source Boston. The way he remembers this event is that basically at 10 a.m. everyone looked at their phones and then left, right? Because every AWS customer went down when AWS went down, except for one, right? Netflix, right? And there was a seminal blog post that described how they did it, and essentially they said, the only way to survive failure is to fail all the time. And there's a critical quote here. They have this thing called Chaos Monkey, right? Whose job is to randomly kill instances and services within our architecture in production, right? And so imagine how great life could be, right? If you could take all the things that could go wrong and actually test not only in the QA environment, but actually test in production so that we get really, really good at detecting and recovering from failures when they occur, because failure is inevitable. Remember, you don't get to choose Chaos Monkey. Chaos Monkey chooses you. And so it's not just about breaking things in production. We want to break things as early as we can in the deployment pipeline, right? So wherever you have an opportunity, right, to put asserts, to put checks in so that we have consistency across code and environments and configurations, right, do so, right? Because there's no better cultural fit when you have a continuous integration in place. We can just integrate into the automated testing, framework. So pattern number 6, I think, is actually a prerequisite for this. One of the this is Marty Kagan. Marty Kagan, he wrote a book called Inspired, and he's hailed as a hero in the product management space. And one of his lessons learned after being the VP of product management at eBay is you must allocate 20% of cycles to technical debt reduction. So why would Marty Kagan say such a thing? He inherited eBay around 2002, right, after the chronic site failures, right? And he says, if you don't reserve 20% for technical debt reduction, you're going to have 100% of your cycles spent on debt reduction, right? So he's like the person who showed up in jail after he lost his wife and kids, saying, don't be like me, right? This is a lifelong lesson that he carries around, and I recommend you do the same. And the result of doing this is that you can finally take this that turns into this and take the time to turn it into this, right? And by the way, if you have a Kanban board, I think another sort of visual check on this is that you have all the features, the cards that are features in yellow, have the technical debt reduction, or the non-functional requirements, in blue, right? So that means at a glance you can see, right, are about 20% of the cards blue, and more importantly, are they marching across the board, right? So they are actually making it into production. Last thing I'll close on in terms of innovation culture. This is a phenomenal quote that I'm just dazzled by. Scott Cook is the founder of Intuit, and he said, by installing this rampant innovation culture in the middle of tax filing season for the TurboTax property, they did 165 experiments in 3 months that increased conversion rate 50%. Right? When I first read this, I'm thinking, holy crap, what sort of messianic idiot would change production, right, in your peak season, right? And essentially, not only does it take great operations, right, but think about the business benefit, right? Instead of waiting until the next season to be able to attain customers, they just stole 50% of the customers from the competition. So it's great for ops, and it's great for the business. Okay, so here's an example of the Kanban board, right, where the non-functional requirements are in blue. All right, so why do I think this is important? One is that, I mentioned to you this downward spiral happens in every IT organization, right? And it certainly does have a lot of business harm, and it harms operations and development. But more importantly, I think it causes damage to us as human beings, right? And when we feel trapped in a system that preordains us to failure, that's never a good thing. And these are things that actually we take home to our families. So, the 3 mitigations, so to repeat, to summarize, imagine what you can do if you put these 6 principles, 6 practices into work, right? By making work visible, making environments early, by getting development more integrated into operations, by waking them up more, by integrating them into the daily processes of operations, and then creating this culture where we want to break things, and we reserve 20% of our capacity for the improvement of the environment, right? Now we have fragile code getting less fragile. We have more deployments going to production. We have less time spent on deployments, more time spent on infrastructure improvement, right? And now we're finally generating capabilities that actually should result in developers and the business saying not only, gosh, it sure sucks not sucking, but they could, the ideal reaction is thank you, right? Thank you so much for making all of our lives better, and thank you so much for helping us win in the marketplace, and thank you really for making an incredible contribution to the business. So, that's this, and I think kind of, again, the human side of this is I represent this picture. One is like, hey, thank goodness IT operations was here to save the day. Thank you for your contribution. And I really love this picture, right? This is like this is actually development inviting us to the deployment parties for the first time, saying, hey, those IT ops guys aren't so bad after all, right? We should invite them to all our parties because they really helped us win. So, and I think the end outcome is this, right? I'm not sure if anyone actually gets to do more with less these days, but we can certainly do more with less effort. Just to conclude, I mentioned about why I think this is such an important problem. Our co-author and I, Mike Orzen, we actually did a computation that said how much business value could we create if we could just have the amount of IT waste that's associated with DevOps and then get 5 times the value of it in some way. And the number came out to $3 trillion per year, right? $3 trillion per year. That's actually more than the entire economic output of Germany. Just think for a moment of like what that could do for productivity, for standards of living, and the way I think about it is like I think about how much that could affect the lives of my children who are going to inherit the world that we're creating right now. So we're working on 2 books right now. One is called When IT Fails, a business novel, and the DevOps Cookbook. And I'm so pleased that I've gotten so much support from Mr. James Turnbull. I'm grateful for your help. Our goal at IT Revolution Press is to positively impact the lives of 1 million workers in the next 5 years. And so in this time, I was only able to share 6 of my favorite patterns, but obviously there's a lot more. If you're interested in getting a paper that we wrote called The Top 11 Things You Need to Know About DevOps, and if you're interested in getting, if you're interested in getting that and the resources on the books, go to this URL, instantcustomer.com/go74730, or pick up your phone and put your email address to 74730, and you'll instantly get that paper. But the bigger news is thanks to Luke and Puppet, we'll actually randomly select 200 people who actually do this, and you'll get a free copy of When IT Fails, a business novel, when it ships on January 15th of next year. So thank you, Puppet Labs, and thank you very much. And we're also hosting a meetup at 8 p.m., and don't miss John's talk tomorrow morning. Thank you so much, and I genuinely appreciate the time.